This is part 2 of Antony C. Sutton's book, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy, and I'll be talking about chapters 4 and 5 today. Summary of the main ideas of Professor Sutton's book. First, he says that Andrew Jackson was the last president that was not under the influence of what Sutton called the few or the establishment elite. He mentions that both Presidents Martin Van Buren and Abraham Lincoln tried to curb the power of this elite but were unsuccessful. Socialism, in both theory and practice, is created by the same elite money monopoly, supported by them and controlled by them. Those who wield political power use the monetary system and debt to those ends. In order to prove that the money monopoly creates and propagates socialism, Sutton uses the example of the Roosevelt dynasty. Establishment textbooks promote the Roosevelt presidents, particularly Franklin D. Roosevelt, as heroic figures. FDR is seen as a strong president who brought the United States out of the Great Depression and through most of World War II. As already noted in another video, however, FDR's son-in-law, Curtis Dahl, wrote a book called My Exploited Father-in-Law, in which he concluded that most of FDR's great ideas were in truth formulated by the Council on Foreign Relations, not by FDR himself. Chapter 4 of Dr. Sutton's book is called Roosevelt's Socialist Manifesto. And you can see a picture on the bottom right-hand side of this slide that shows that the book was called The Science of Government Founded on Natural Law. Sutton points out that the connection between the Roosevelt family and the Bank of New York is very strong. FDR was powerful within the political organization called Tammany Hall. This was the name given to the powerful Democratic political machine that dominated New York City politics. Sutton says that according to one of FDR's biographers, he was in effect liaison officer between the Hall and Wall Street, one who carried orders from the bankers to the politicians and dictated nominations and elections in a ruthless manner. Long before FDR was president, James J. Roosevelt was a member of the New York State Legislature in 1835, 1839, and 1840. But even before that, a Roosevelt named Clinton Roosevelt, born in 1804, had connections with the rise of socialism in America. Clinton Roosevelt wrote a socialist manifesto some years before Karl Marx wrote his, or should I say plagiarized it, his famous Communist Manifesto in 1848. Roosevelt was a cousin of FDR, and when comparing FDR's New Deal policies with those proposed by Clinton Roosevelt in his booklet, it's impossible not to see the remarkable similarity between the two plans. The booklet, called The Science of Government Founded on Natural Law, was published in 1841. Interestingly, the book has been removed from the current Library of Congress catalog, although it was listed in an earlier 1959 version. The booklet, which is written as a dialogue between the author, i.e. the few, and a producer, i.e. the many or the rest of us, proposes a totalitarian government much like that suggested by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. In the conversation between the two, Roosevelt compares government under the Constitution to a sinking ship. He says, in reference to the Constitution, that it is a ship put hastily together when we left the British flag, and it was then thought an experiment a very doubtful issue. Clinton Roosevelt describes a hierarchical system of government whereby all individuality is submerged into the collective whole. This system depended on the art and science of cooperation. This is to bring the whole to bear for our mutual advantage, according to the book. In Roosevelt's hierarchical system, Each man is appointed to whatever type of work the marshal of creation at the top decides he is best fit for. The marshal of creation must balance production and consumption. So this then is central planning at its finest. People in the system have very little or no choice in occupation. In summary, Clinton Roosevelt is proposing a totalitarian government without individual rights that is run by an elitist establishment. In Chapter 5, Sutton reviews key points about Karl Marx and his Communist Manifesto of 1848. He reveals interesting information about Marx, including the fact that most of the manifesto was plagiarized. Marx was paid to write it, and he was also funded by a host of sources that are quite surprising. These include members of the ruling elite, which supposedly he despised, the pirate Jean Lafitte, who was an agent of American banking interests and wrote in his journal all about his meetings with Mr. Marx and Engels, Charles Anderson Dana, editor of the New York Tribune, which was owned by Horace Greeley, who was also associated with Clinton Roosevelt. Dana hired Marx to write for the New York Tribune. Frederick Engels also provided some funding, and he was the son of a wealthy cotton manufacturer. Most surprising of all is that Marx received funding from the Prussian elite, who were connected to his wife Jenny. So again, he's posing as the friend of the working person, and he's being funded by all of these elite, very wealthy groups and people. Sutton's main point in relating all of this was to answer one question. The question, why would the elite fund Marx? The answer Sutton gives, because the entire Marxist philosophical battery is aimed at the extermination of the middle class and the supremacy of the elite. Marxism is a device for consolidating power by the elite. It has nothing to do with relieving the misery of the poor or advancing mankind. It is an elitist political device, pure and simple. And as for my comment, critique, and analysis, Roosevelt's proposal for a totalitarian government illustrates his belief in a key principle of Hegelianism, that the state is supreme over all, and that individuals are merely cogs in the state and must be obedient to all of its demands. It is no wonder, then, that Roosevelt has little use for the Constitution and describes it as a sinking ship. The Constitution, with its structure of diffused power, does not allow for government control to be centralized in the hands of a collective. Instead, it creates a federal system whereby power is shared by a central government, state governments, and local governments. Police, education, business, and other aspects of society are separate from the central government and not controlled by it. In this way, the Founding Fathers made sure that it would be nigh impossible for any one entity or group to gain control over the entire U.S. government because power is simply too diffuse. The economic system proposed by Clinton Roosevelt strongly resembles the one proposed by Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto. Marx sought to eliminate the capitalist system, and this is what Clinton Roosevelt is presenting in his booklet through central planning and the elimination of supply and demand market forces. Once again, the same names keep coming up over and over again in the history of U.S. politics: Roosevelt, Bush, Clinton, etc., etc. The common man and woman obviously has scant ability to exercise any control at all over the political scene because the elites have it all wrapped up. Marx's Communist Manifesto lists 10 objectives. Supposedly, when these 10 points will have been achieved, the destruction of the middle class in the U.S. would be assured. Marx talks about all of the 10 points as being equally important, but practically all of them have already been completed, that Dr. Sutton notes in his book. And then of note, I would like to point out that the 16th Amendment, or the income tax, is especially important because for 200 years our country existed with no income tax. And then all of a sudden you have the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 with the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, and just poof, all of a sudden, we now need to amend the Constitution and we need to have an income tax. So I think that's very, very important to note because that was one of Marx's key objectives. And another key objective of Marx that I think is also important to note is objective number 10, which is public and free education, read indoctrination of all children. Questions to think about. Why is the Clinton-Roosevelt book suppressed? And why has it been removed from the Library of Congress? I had to find it in another book that included a reprint of it in order to read it. Emmanuel Josephson wrote a book in 1955, which he dedicated to the U.S. Constitution. And in his book, he included a reprint of the Roosevelt's Communist Manifesto. And in other words, the science of government founded on national law. So that is the way that I was able to get a copy of the book and I was able to read it. And it's disturbing to me that this book is being suppressed. Is there a connection between the last point of Marx's agenda, the establishment of a free public education system, and the indoctrination toward Marxism that is taking place right now in public schools across the United States? And last, reflecting upon the events of the last year, 2020, it is apparent that the destruction of the middle class is ramping up and that people are becoming more and more dependent upon government as savior. Coincidence? Or more Hegelian dialectics at work? Create a problem, wait for the reaction, and rush in with the solution that you had in mind all the time, which in this case would be socialism. See you next time.